All right, so yesterday we talked about select and mask, select subject, remove background, and some pretty advanced tools that are in Photoshop CC. Now, they're advanced in that they do things for you very quickly and very easily without you having to do much of anything. But there's a tool in Photoshop, it's called the color range selection, that has been here for a very long time, and that's what we're going to talk about today on day 17, the color range tool. Now, you may have heard at some point this thing called a luminosity mask. Well, a luminosity mask is mainly just a selection for a given tonal value. So the highlights, the midtones, or the shadows. With this color range tool, you can make really quick, really easy segregations of highlighted midtones and shadows, or individual colors, even skin tones. So we're going to be using the same example images that we've been using over the last, 3 or 4 videos. The reason why I do that is when I find an image that works really good for experimentation, I keep it. Okay, this image is great because it's got a sky that's easily selectable, so I can experiment with different selection tools. It's got highlights, it's got midtones, it's got shadows, it's got color but not too vibrant color. It can take on a lot of different color grading tasks when I'm working with an image like this. Same thing for that portrait photo, great skin tones and perfect for experimenting with a foreground background separation. So the color range tool is up here in select. So if we go to select, we're going to go to color range. So by default, color range will open up with the last thing that you had selected in the selection here. So the last thing I was selecting were skin tones. So here is where we are going to choose things like the sampled color, where if I click on this and then I click on maybe the sky up here, it's going to make a sampled colored selection for that blue sky. If I change this to image right here, I can actually select it on this image for that individual color. Now, this fuzziness slider is basically the intensity of how much of a selection you want. So if I move this down, all the way down, it's going to select things at the pixel-based level, meaning, hey, if I select this with this sampled color, I want the exact pixel and all the pixels in this image that are exactly like this one. As I increase this fuzziness, it increases the tolerance of that selection and says, okay, you can maybe select a little bit more of that sky there or that blue color. It's basically saying, here's the blue color you selected. As you expand the fuzziness, it's going to find other pixels that are closely related to it and grab it and pull it into your selection. So the selection that I'm making right now is anything that's going to be in white, and black is going to be something that's not going to be affected. So that's how you would do a sampled color selection. You can sample any color on your image. You can even press and hold Shift and click other samples of other colors in your image that you would like to select. And if we were just trying to select that sky up there, I could then drag this fuzziness down and then individually shift click all of those pixels that would be like that pixel in this image, which would give me a pretty darn good selection for just that sky. The difference here, though, is if I press OK, the difference is that this mask is also going to include this selection, I should say, is going to include any of the pixels that are closely related to it on the entire image. So if I didn't want it to select these areas up here, I might have to get my lasso tool and press Alt or Option and find the place where those racing ants are and get them out of there, pressing and holding Alt or Option and making a selection for areas that I don't want to be accepted. So that's a way that we could use the sampled color tool to get an exact selection for our sky like that. Okay, let's go back into select and go to color range again. Now, if we go and move on down one, these are individual color selections. So it's going to make a selection for the color red. Any pixel in the image that is closely related to the color red is going to be, this will be the selection that's going to be made. And there's not a very deep value of red here. So it's not 100% potency of the color red. Same thing you're going to see for yellow. So you don't get a pure white with this. It's actually just selecting any of the pixels in the image that are literally cyan, blue, magenta. It doesn't give you that fuzziness range, okay? So if we go to blue, for instance, it's not giving us a fuzziness range to accept more of this selection into it, okay? These are good if you have a lot of data in an individual color, but we don't have a whole lot of data in these individual colors, so it's not going to work out very well for us here. But one of the main things I wanted to show you were the highlights, midtones, and shadows selections. So when you're using these color range adjustments for your highlights, midtones, and shadows, it's kind of like you're using blend if. Okay, so you remember blend if was based on 0 to 255, right? So you can see your range down here for your highlights being 255. So if I bring this all the way up to 255, it's going to select all the pixels that are as closely related to the 255 as possible. Now this fuzziness slider allows me to select more. So if I go all the way down, this is only selecting every pixel that would possibly be 255 pixel value of 255 in that tonal range. As I move this up, it starts to expand that selection and say, okay, we can take on a little bit more of these highlights here, 66% more going outside of that 255 pixel value. If we bring this down, it's going to say, okay, anything that is basically 206 and above, that can be selected. So if I drop this down to the fuzziness, you can see how that is saying, okay, anything that is basically 128 pixels, exactly 128 pixels and beyond, it's going to be everything from your midtones all the way through those highlights. But it doesn't have a very good blend. That's where fuzziness comes in, where you would create that blend, okay? So that's basically a selection for your midtones all the way through your highlights. This is essentially what they call or refer to as a luminosity mask. If you keep that range up to 255 and increase this fuzziness, this is showing you the lightest pixels in the image. It's a great way to segregate your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows. And a lot of times in my workflow, I do this. So I'll create a highlight mask like this or a selection like this on a curves adjustment layer, and I'll call it highlights. So I'll press OK. I'll make a curves adjustment layer, and then I can call this curves adjustment layer highlights. All right. And what that does is it segregates those highlights from the midtones and the shadows in the image and only allows this curve to modify and affect the highlight areas in the photo. So if we go and we select that background again and we go to select, we go to color range, and then we go to midtones, watch this. Here we get a range slider. And this is the range of the black pixels that you want to select into the white pixels that you want to select to be included into this mask. If we were to do something like this down to 128 and 128, bring our fuzziness all the way down. So if we plug in 127 here, and then we plug in 128 here, and this is going to be 127, that's basically going to be a literal selection for your mid-tone areas, or everything that is exactly your mid-tone area. But the beauty and the benefit of using this mid-tone selection is that you can say, okay, I want all the pixel values that are between 100 and let's say 150, okay? And then I want you to expand that out and feather this out a little bit so that that selection becomes a little bit more, it blends a little bit more, okay? This is where you can make a really nice mid-tone range for your image here, so you can get a really nice selection for your midtone. As you increase that fuzziness, it's going to increase how many pixels outside of that original selection get pulled into that selection. Okay, so increase this a little bit more, and then we'll press OK. And we can call this, we can make a curves adjustment layer here and call this midtones. Okay, so now I'll click on that background. I'll go to select, I'll go to color range, and then I'll go to shadows. And with this, we're basically saying, okay, everything that is the 0 pixel value, select. And then increase that fuzziness outside of that. So this will be your darkest dark areas, essentially. And we can increase the range of this to grab more pixels into that selection. But a lot of times, if the fuzzier you can get it, it's a technical term, the more feathered you can get it, the better it's going to blend with everything else. We'll press OK, and we can call this shadows. Make a curves adjustment layer and call this shadows. So now I've got my highlights right here, I've got my midtones right here, and my shadows right here. So what does that allow me to do? Well, that basically gives me a mask for every one of my tonal areas in my image. My shadows, my midtones, and my highlights. What means that I can use those masks on any adjustment layers or any other images that I might bring into here to blend with this image, which is really great because if we're in our shadows here and we increase the brightness of our shadows here, just right in that midtone, so that we're basically saying, okay, the midtones of our shadows can get brighter, but let's let the darkest dark areas get darker, okay? We're getting a much more laser precision adjustment here. So in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, you have highlights, midtones, and shadows, correct? Or you have highlights and shadows, and you have blacks and whites, right? That's essentially what we're doing here, but we're doing it on a curve, which gives us the ability to go into our highlights, or as we're looking at here, it goes into our shadows and say, let the darkest dark areas of my shadows get a little bit darker, but let the mid-tone areas of my shadows get brighter. So you get laser precision, surgical precision over the tonal adjustments in your image when you understand how to separate your highlights, midtones, and shadows, and also use that curves adjustment layer with it. This is where you get really extreme editing. It can be fast. It sounds like it's rather slow right now, but you can speed this process up. You can make things that are actionable that make this a much faster process, which we'll talk about later when we talk about our workflow automation lesson, which will be much later in this course. But what you can also do here is you can make your own individual color adjustments for your highlights, your midtones, and shadows as well, which really helps with the color grading process or the act of getting the viewer into your image through the use of color to make that photo better. For instance, what I could do with this, with the shadowy areas, is I can make a new solid color layer here, make this a bluish solid color layer. I could press Alt or Option on this mask, drag it up, and drop it onto this mask here. And now I've got a solid blue that is washing all the shadow areas, which I'd probably drop the opacity here and maybe change this to soft light or even color so that this shadow area now gets that blue color over it. So you might say to yourself, okay, Blake, you've showed us blend if, and now you're showing us these color range masks. What's the difference between the two of them? Well, really, in reality, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two of them as when it comes to what they are selecting, but it's the function in which you're using them. So with a blend if this was a blend if selection for this color range, anything that changed pixel values underneath that blend if would then shift to accept that color. Here, what we're doing is we're saying blue, you can only go into these white areas and these white areas only. Period. So they have their differences. And this also becomes a little bit easier to see exactly where it is that those things are being applied to. Also, we can still paint on here too. So if I grab my brush tool, B for my brush tool, make that brush smaller, and I start painting with black here, what you'll start to see is that I'm painting away this area and saying, okay, yeah, blue, you can affect the shadow areas in the lower portion of the photo, but don't do it for this upper portion. We're basically blocking out any of that stuff up there. So it's a way of combining the color range and masking so that you can, again, get laser precision and laser focused editing on your photos. So when all the time I'm asked, Blake, why do you use Photoshop so much in your workflow? It's because I want this surgical precision over my midtones, my highlights, my shadows, and everything in the photograph, okay? The next one, let's take a look at this image. So for this, I'm going to go to Select, I'm going to color range, and in the color range, I'm going to go down here to skin tones. You see, with skin tones, we can actually select the skin in the photograph, and you can set it to detect faces too. So when we set it to detect faces here, we start increasing this fuzziness, you can start to see that we get a really good mask for just where the face of our skin tone selection is. If we turn detect faces off, we don't get quite as good of a selection here. So keep detect faces on, and that will help detect the actual skin tones in the face to separate that from other things in the image that might be closely related to skin tones. Because this skin tone selection will select anything that looks kind of like an orangish yellow. So in that last image of Yosemite, it would actually be selecting that granite rock face. That's considered a skin tone in Photoshop's mind. It's thinking skin tones look awfully like this yellow orange, so I'm going to make that. Okay, so if we press OK on this, we now have a selection for just her skin tones. And how that can be helpful is if we were to go into something like a curves adjustment layer. I use that a lot because it gives me individual adjustments over highlights, midtones, and shadows in individual masks or individual areas in my image. So if I say, let's do a curves adjustment layer, okay? We're going to brighten up her face a little bit, but darken down the shadows of her face, okay? And then we want to change this because it's really pushing the contrast and the colors. So let's change this to luminosity. So it only affects the luminance values and not the color in the image. So let me bring this up just a little bit more. And I think I might want to bring that down a little bit, actually. It looks better down. It sculpts her face a little bit more. And then maybe bring the highlight areas of her face up. It's kind of like, there we go. Look at that. It helps sculpt the detail in her face a little bit more. We made a selection for her skin tones. We set it to luminosity so it wouldn't affect the color in the image. It just affects the skin tones of the image. We then made her darker skin tones darker by pulling this portion of the curve down. We made the midtones in her face a little bit darker by pulling this selection down. but then we brought everything back up in the highlight areas in her face by bringing this up. Okay, and look at how wonderful that is. If we don't want that to affect her arm, that's pretty easy. All we got to do is take B for our brush tool on our mask, and we can brush away right here on her arm so that that doesn't kind of pop forward as much as it did, because it was kind of pixelating out her skin tones a little bit there. And that looks really good. It's like we've sculpted her face a little bit more. If we don't want it to affect her hair as much, easy enough, Alt or Option. We'll click on the mask so we can see that mask. We'll make our brush smaller, and we'll brush away her hair. Now we maybe want to do this delicately with a lighter hand so that it just, there we go, okay? And then we'll click back over here to get away from that. And now you see the before and the after. Just affects her skin tone and her face. But because we have this now set on its own individual mask, we can do anything we want with that as well. Let's say we go over here and make let's add a solid color fill, okay? And we'll make this a reddish solid, deep red solid color fill. I'm gonna press Alt or Option on this to be a clipping mask to clip into this area of her face. Now that looks horrible. It looks hideous, I know. But let's go ahead and change this to the maybe soft light blend mode. Not overlay, soft light. Doesn't look too bad. It's really dark. That's okay. We drop this down, the opacity down a little bit. We're just adding a little bit of color to her face there. You see that? Now we can make this any color we want. We can double click this now. We can make this any color we want. And every color is going to do something different to her face when we have it set up like this. But this is where we can get some really nice individualized adjustments, even with color on our photos. And you might be thinking, well, okay, that's skin tones. What happens if we go to Select, go to Color Range, and do Sampled Color, and then click on our face? Not too bad either there. That might actually be a better adjustment for her face when we do that. But when we bring it all the way up, we're going to be selecting every pixel that's like that pixel in the background as well. So we have to be careful with that, okay? So skin tones, the skin tone selection can be a really good selection. It gives us a really quick and dirty selection for her face. Sampled color gives us the ability to drop this down based off the individual tones in her face or skin tones. If you wanted to select more than one tone at a given time with this sampled color, we could press and hold Shift and click on any of those other colors in her face, and now you can see we're getting pretty close to what that skin tone selection was, because we pressed and hold Shift and clicked on all those tones in her face. Okay, so whether you use the sampled color or the individual selections, this can be a great way to separate elements in your photo. And a lot of times you'll see me using masks this way. Everybody's workflow is different in Photoshop, and everyone's going to teach you something different in Photoshop. That's the beauty of Photoshop, is that everyone's going to use it in a different way. I use selections like this a lot. I like to grab different areas of the image and just segregate them from the rest of the photograph and just work on that area with that surgical precision so that I can really draw the attention to certain areas that I want to. And that's why I'm teaching you this. That's why I taught you all of these masking techniques from the very beginning, from just a regular painted mask all the way through all the selections and the different types of selection masks that you can make. This is going to come in handy in your workflow. I didn't learn these things until probably 15 or 16 years into my Photoshop experience. So the last 4 or 5 years for me have been extremely powerful. A power user is what they call it, a power Photoshop user for selecting individual areas in the photograph. You do have to be careful with that though, because as you can see, you can really blow out some pixels and make them look really bad. So you want to make sure everything's got a nice smooth transition and it's a slow build up process. Now imagine using this color range selection with Select and Mask that we used yesterday. Boom. So you make that selection, then you do the Select and Mask to get your selection dialed in perfectly. And we're talking about making laser targeted selections here. So your homework for today, experiment with the color range tools. In tomorrow's lesson, we're going to talk about cleanup tools. And these are things where you can select different parts of your photograph to repair other parts of your photograph. It's mind-boggling and it's awesome and you're going to love it.